Welcome back, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I hope everybody had a refreshing lunch break. The title of this session is Walk the Walk, Translating Climate Ambition into Investment Opportunities. And as Femi just said, we want to talk about how those nationally determined contributions that were essentially the breakthrough at COP21, if you remember, it was that bottom-up approach that really led to the breakthrough, how these NDCs can help both governments and investors to focus and prioritize climate action in general and capital flows in particular. So we have an absolutely outstanding array of policymakers and financial industry representatives to talk about the challenges of translating the NDCs into really concrete action, into investment plans. And we also want to showcase a few success stories. And our key questions that we're going to be looking at in this panel: what role can private finance play in achieving the NDC commitments? How can international support facilitate NDC implementation? Those are just a couple of the questions we're going to be addressing, also with you, ladies and gentlemen. And I'd like to now ask the panelists to please join me here on stage. Ask you to just ask one down there. And you, if you wouldn't mind there, please, Ms. Calderon. And Ingrid in the middle. And Juan Pedro is here.
Okay, super.
No, one more over, Ingrid, if you'll move one over. Exactly. Okay. Perfect. And
all right, we follow the
empty seat for you. Thank you so much. So it is my pleasure to introduce, seated next to me, Juan Pedro Searle. He is the head of climate change for the Ministry of Energy in Chile, and he has jumped in at very, very short notice for Ms. Rossana Gaete, who was supposed to have been with us and unfortunately has lost her voice, so we wish her a very rapid recovery, and we are so grateful to you for this very spontaneous participation. Indeed, it's always a challenge to jump in at the last minute. So great that you could do that. Seated next to him is Ms. Sylvia Calderon Diaz. She is Director of Environment and Sustainable Development at the Department of National Planning in Colombia. It's wonderful to have both of you with us, having traveled from so far to be here. So a very warm welcome to you indeed. Next up is Ms. Ingrid Hoven. She is Director General at the Department for Global Issues of Germany's Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, the BMZ, and she has had a long career at the ministry, most recently as Special Envoy for Climate and Development. Seated next to her is Graham Smith. He is Mr. Frédéric Samama. He is co-head of institutional clients coverage at Amundi, private sector finance, with a focus on climate change, financial innovation, and research. And he has a very long record of innovation in this climate space. So we're going to be very interested to hear your contributions. And finally, very pleasing to have with us Graham Smith. He's Director and Leader of the Sustainable Finance Unit at Global Banking at HSBC, and he is a green financing specialist who's leading HSBC's team working with the Green Climate Fund and the Catalytic Finance Initiative. And ladies and gentlemen, just a reminder that we are very eager to hear from you in the course of our panel. And in fact, we're going to begin with a question to you. So I'm going to ask Michael to just read that off and get the voting process started.
All right. Here comes a question you might have to refresh as you've checked your email or whatever. Just refresh the window. And here is the question. The biggest challenges facing countries as they move to implement NDCs are climate needs are so great they crowd out other needs. Already planned development aid inhibits a shift to climate projects. The Ministry of Finance does not give approval to prioritize climate, or, and whichever, lack of cooperation across ministries. Let's see. It's on the screen as well. I know you can't read this on your phone. The answers are: climate needs are so great they crowd each other out. Already planned development aid inhibits a shift to climate projects. Ministry of Finance does not give approval to prioritize climate, or the lack of cooperation across ministries, the big dubious winner.
Yeah, interesting. Far and away the winner, at least so far on the voting. Okay, many thanks for that. We just want to factor that in now in our first round of answers as we do talk about what that process of translating intention into action entails. And I'd like to go first of all to Chile, which recently took the very noteworthy decision to phase out coal-fired power plants unless they have carbon capture and storage technology, and is also the first country in the region, or amongst the first countries in the region, to adopt a national carbon tax. So, question to you, Mr. Searle, how Chile's NDC is being translated into action within your own ministry, how it's influencing policy making and implementation, including in those areas that I just mentioned.
Yeah, it's not an easy question, I guess. We're just starting. I think one of the main challenges that we face as a government, as a country, and also as a sector is to many challenges. But the first one will be how to get the private sector on board, get, other ministries or other stakeholders to understand, deeply what the NDC means. So ideally to maybe transform the NDC into the overarching climate change policy. And I'm afraid that for that to happen, we will need to do at least two things in relation to the private sector. One is to maybe develop a regulation, specific one, to determine sectoral responsibilities on one side, but also that would be the stick, okay? And the carrot would be to maybe to provide certainty of a long-term price signal, so they can also, make use of carbon pricing to achieve the NDC. But we have a lot of challenges. Investments. Where do we get money to really put the NDC into operation? And also, one last challenge maybe is to change the NDC from this intensity-based target to a more absolute target, and to make it more ambitious every 5 years, for example.
One brief follow-up question. When you saw the returns coming in on that poll to the audience, clear majority in the room thinks that coordination between ministries is an issue. Is it an issue for Chile?
It's an issue, yeah. I think maybe the Ministry of Finance should be more involved in this, because it means it involves money. We need to get public funding, private funding, donor funding. It's something.
Thank you very much. I was interested to hear you mention sectoral plans.
Yeah.
It made me think you must have spent the lunch break talking to Ms. Calderon, because in fact Colombia does have, or is moving to adopt, sectoral mitigation action plans as part of its NDC implementation phase. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that, why you're using those, and what challenges in general you are facing as you move toward implementation.
Definitely. I think the answers of the public, of the audience, were very related to the Colombian experience. The first challenge that we had to face in Colombia is to make sure that all ministries, all sectors had a say in the NDC, and they came and to come up with a specific target for the sectors, and a target that for sure could add up to our whole country NDC. So that was one of the first challenge, to define a specific target for the sector. And after a couple of months, a couple of meetings in which also the private sector participated and the civil society, we were able to come up with specific sector targets. And the next challenge then would be how to translate those targets into sectoral plans. A target, it's important, but it's not enough. We need to know how to achieve the target. So then we moved on into preparing sectoral climate change plans. They have to be comprehensive. Remember that our NDC not only covers mitigation, but also adaptation, and this is a very important issue for the country. So then we needed to define specific and prioritize actions. So right now, our sectoral plans comprehend 46 priority actions that give a clear signal to markets, to the private sector, where investment, the country and the government thinks should start going. And also, those actions include a set of policies that need to be adopted or need to be reformed currently in the country in order to enable future public and private finance.
If I also, again, come back to that poll, was there a lot of battling amongst ministries and amongst stakeholders trying to hammer out those plans?
Definitely. The first answer is basically, why should I contribute to climate change if basically Colombia doesn't contribute to climate change overall? And at the end, we ended up facing the same international discussions internally in the country. And at the end, it was important to show the sectors that this was an opportunity to increase productivity, to increase competitiveness, to be able to access future international markets. And that's how sectors started to see the opportunities and the investment opportunities behind these targets. At the beginning, we wanted to have a cost-effective approach, probably to define the targets based on which measures, which actions should be more cost-effective. But then it was hard to come up with an outcome that added up to the whole NDC. So at the end, we decided just to split the NDC into 20, our NDC is 20% reduction by 2030 in relation to our baseline. So we decided to reduce 20% in each of the economic sectors.
Mr. Searle would like to jump in, please.
Yeah, it's not that Chile started from scratch. We have a policy framework in the energy sector. We have the energy policy for 2050. We will have an energy route for 2018 and 2022. We have a mitigation action plan for the energy sector, but we need commitments, funding, commitment from private sector, and it's not magic.
We're coming back to that. We're gonna address that one next. Okay. So thank you for that reminder. Ingrid, Hoven, the government of Germany has been a very strong supporter on the issue of NDC implementation right from the start, essentially as soon as COP21 had taken place. I'd like to talk a little bit about the details of that support later on, but perhaps you could just say a word also coming back to the poll about the challenges that are involved. What are you seeing in your own experience in terms of the challenges that countries face as we move toward that implementation date of 2020, and perhaps even for Germany itself? After all, NDCs affect all countries.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Melinda. Actually, Germany started to support developing countries even in the run-up to Paris, and around 40 countries received some kind of capacity building or institutional support in order to present the intended national contributions. And then after Paris, we thought, oh, this is a wonderful outcome, but how can we make sure that now actually countries can implement those NDCs? For Development Cooperation Ministry, our goal is really to align our whole development cooperation vis-à-vis those NDCs, because we believe that there is no either or. You can't achieve the SDGs without actually implementing the Paris Agreement and vice versa. So for us, this is not a contradiction and not an add-on to do the NDCs, but really it's about finding the sweet spots, combining development action with climate action. And so we are starting to convince our regional departments who do most of our bilateral cooperation really to align the whole cooperation vis-à-vis NDCs. How do we do this? For instance, when we speak with governments, and some are more advanced than others, Colombia and Chile certainly are role models in this respect, is to figure out what is contained in the NDCs. Some NDCs are already almost investment plans, so it's easier to pick up a specific action, a project, a program. In some other cases, much more work is being needed, like to drive down and to do the sectoral work, the analytical work. So we are supporting also UNDP and the World Bank, and we are working through our bilateral agencies, KfW and GIZ, to provide this very specific support to make out of an NDC a business case or an investment plan. This is one action. I have to admit that certainly we are still underway. In some cases, we are not yet there. What we try to do is also to bring other actors on board, as I said, like multilateral development banks. On cross-sectoral coordination, and then I come back to the German experience, when Germany elaborated 2 years ago the Climate Action Plan 2050, the first time ever we introduced like sectoral goals that were just described also by our Colombian colleague. And this was done in a very lengthy, and it took us months really to negotiate those goals, because we wanted to get firm commitments by the transport sector, the agricultural sector, what they have to contribute to more ambitious climate goals in Germany. And there, of course, I mean, different things come into play because when you do a transformation, then some sectors have to move quicker than others, possibly, and all have to contribute. And this was certainly not the case 10 years ago, where perhaps climate action mainly was concentrated on the energy sector and the other fields were left out. And this is not longer possible if you really want to get us to 2 degrees or if possible to 1.5 degree of global warming. So all sectors have to contribute. And what we have learned finally is that, I mean, implementing the NDCs, this is not something for the Environment Ministry. Finally, it's a whole of society task. And it even goes beyond government, and we have to bring other stakeholders as well to get us to ambitious goals.
Let's move straight on to those two other stakeholders who are on this panel, namely finance sector representatives. It has been clear from the inception of the Paris Agreement and before, I think many of us will remember that financial institutions were amongst those who called before Paris even took place for real action on the ground there. So, are we seeing, in your view, Mr. Samama and Mr. Smith, real changes in the investment landscape now as we move toward activation of the NDCs? Mr. Samama?
Yes, absolutely. It's changing, but there's as well a call for financial innovation. Why? So I will start with a problem, and I will follow up with a solution. The problem being that, yes, we have the NDCs, but we all know that they're requiring massive amounts of money, and that local public money is not enough. So we know that. We know as well that on the other hand, you have massive pools of assets in developed markets that are facing a low yield environment. And the fact that we don't have a bridge between these two worlds is actually costly for both parties, because there's a lack of financing of the green infrastructures in emerging markets, and in developed markets, they are not benefiting from the high yields. So it's a kind of lose-lose game for both parties. So when you have such a situation, it's a call for innovation. And here, I'm glad to report that IFC came with a very smart idea. They said, let's analyze why we don't have such an efficient situation, why it's blocked. And they came to the conclusion that there were two reasons. The first one was that for developed markets, it was very risky to invest into emerging markets, or it was perceived being risky. So they said, we know how to handle that. We can put in place a risk-sharing mechanism. Second, when we talk about infrastructures, we have to be fair. For many investors, they don't know how to do it. They don't know how to do it locally. If you ask a French investor, a German investor, do you invest into infrastructures locally? The answer will be no. So it doesn't make so much sense to ask them to do it abroad if they don't do it locally. And here, IFC said, what about using green bonds issued by banks? If we do so, we will have the money of the investors investing into green bonds being issued by banks. And we know how to evaluate banks, very well-known animals. And then the banks will channel the money towards infrastructure projects. So we know how to decouple the risks from where we are channeling the money to. Concretely, we announced last February, so a few months ago, a few weeks ago, that we will deploy more than $2 billion into green bonds being issued by banks in emerging markets. And where is the money coming from? Here, in Europe. So we are taking the money from pension funds, insurance companies, and so on, based in Europe, and we are channeling this money towards banks in Mexico, Morocco, China, Turkey, and so on, that will finance locally their green infrastructure projects. So we are creating a bridge between the two worlds. For that, there was a need for innovation, and that's exactly what IFC did, and we are very pleased to have been selected by IFC to implement this project.
Many thanks. Mr. Smith, speak to the same question if you like, but I'd like to ask you to add on something in addition, and it would be this. What you, as a financer, need from the public sector to really maximize your contribution to NDC implementation? What are the best practices that you're seeing out there in your work in the area of green climate financing, and where do perhaps the obstacles lie?
Okay. I would say the NDCs are obviously a step in the right direction, but it's a bit like when you start off on a journey and you've got to go a long way. You start off by heading for the motorway, and you get a motorway sign saying you need to go that way. But that doesn't tell you how to get to the end of the journey. So you need governments to start saying, okay, and the signage for the A roads, the main roads, this will follow. And then you'll get the local signage, and then you'll get the signage right down to the street level to get you where you need to go. And at the moment, the NDCs are just motorway signage. They're saying, go that way, but the rest of it hasn't really followed. And I'll give an example. The UK NDCs, big part of the UK NDCs are around clean air. So the UK government has produced some legislation called the Clean Air Act. And an example of how that's not working is the fact the UK government has been sued twice for failure to implement the Clean Air Act. So is it doing anything? Well, yes, it's pushing towards things like electric vehicles. We've seen the first ultra-low emission zones coming out in cities. We've seen the UK government introduce legislation around making buildings more energy efficient. So we're starting to see more of these main road signs coming. But at the same time, for the private sector to really engage, we need much, much more understanding of what the playing field will be. And I'll give you an example. Everyone says we should all be really pleased about the idea of electric vehicles, cars, taxis, vans, trucks, buses, because they will be zero emissions. No answer to that. That's obvious. But also, people saying they will be really cheap to run. Now, this is true. An example I was given by one company in the UK was it costs around about £65 to fill a car full of petrol in the UK, around about 250, 300-mile range. You can fill the same car, if it's an electric vehicle, with the same amount of energy for the same range for £3.50. Now, that sounds really great, but if you're a bank, you go, okay, but that £65, that includes £35 to £37 worth of fuel duty. So when I, as a bank, am financing electric vehicles, and I'm doing this on the understanding that these vehicles may cost more, but their energy is going to be a lot cheaper, I'm going to have in the back of my mind that sometime the UK government is going to take that £35 of tax and is going to add it to that £3.50 of electricity. Now, I need to know when and how they're going to do that, because I need to work that into my decisions. And so I need that level of clarity coming down. Now, you asked also about, okay, what's best practice public sector? Well, that's one example of public sector helping. An example of the multis helping is where you look at projects, and once you've got down to that level of granularity, you say, okay, this bit, private sector really can't do. There's too much political risk, there's too much cross-currency risk. That, I think, is where the multis can really help, where they come in and they go, okay, that bit, no, it's difficult for you, that bit we will do. But overall, I would say for the private sector, get in and engage and understand that the private sector thinks about these things in depth and needs to know the answers. Private sector will figure out a lot itself, but it needs to have that real clarity down to quite a granular level.
Thank you very much. And we have an audience poll on a related question. So can I get Michael to read off that second audience poll for us?
Yes, that's the following. Can international partners...
Sorry, the one in between. Should be the biggest challenge for translating NDCs into bankable plans.
I don't have that. Sorry.
Oh,
I'll build it in,
all
and
right,
I'll
no
get
problem.
back to you in a minute.
No problem at all. I mean, essentially, we've addressed a couple of the issues that are involved in making that transition from NDCs into bankable plans. But let me just then again ask both Chile and Colombia, both Mr. Searle and Ms. Calderon, where you see the biggest challenges for your governments. And some of the options that we had on that vote that we're not going to be taking are, for example, lacking know-how to prepare clear investment packages, also the risk perceptions that were just mentioned a couple of times, and the possibility that you sometimes get stuck in the near term and lose sight of the longer term, so what is sometimes called path dependency and lock-in. So perhaps address any or all of those, if you like, and tell us what do you see as the biggest challenges for you going forward.
Want to go first?
Sure.
You? Okay. We have a long-term view in the energy sector, so up to 2050. But I think the main challenge is the first one, in the sense of maybe not knowledge, but to transform this NDC into investment plans. But I mean, with huge impacts in terms of emission reduction, but also in other benefits. So that I think it's a must. We have, I mean, as I said, we have the space for that to happen. We have these policies. You mentioned decarbonization. You mentioned the carbon tax. We have a lot of instruments. But we need to sit and really think thoroughly on the role of NDC and how the country should move quickly into this zero net emissions strategy, I mean, up to 2050 or even beyond that. And that's a big, big challenge and a big chunk of money, I guess, we will need, not only from, 100% overseas, but domestic funding from banks in Chile, for example. So these are the type of audiences that we need to tackle also, to sit with private banks and see how they can move together with us.
And you had, in fact, mentioned, here we go, by the way, that's the question we were talking about. So you had mentioned need for capital.
Yeah.
What about risk perceptions? Risk perceptions make cost of capital too high, is the way it's phrased here. Right. What can you do to tackle that?
I don't know. I mean, I think one of the key issues for that, maybe to avoid a little bit that, is to communicate better what the NDC means. Not in terms of barriers, but in terms of the benefits. And I think that, and with a clear pathway to the future, clear policies, long-standing ones, I think that could maybe address part of it.
So transparency and information counteract risk. Ms. Calderon.
I think that's the question that I would like to know, and everyone here, the answer, and how to translate our NDC into investment plans. What we did in Colombia, firstly, was to analyze the cost of our NDC. We estimated that in Colombia, we need to make every year from now until 2030 investments of at least $1 billion every year. And the second thing is to know whether what's the nature of the investment. Should the investment be of private or of public nature? And we estimate that around 60%, at least 60% of investments should come from the private sector, as many of the mitigation measures, of course, rely on consumers or producers. Now, how to translate that into specific bankable projects? We talk all the time with the financial sector and with the real economy sector. The financial sector keeps telling us we're ready. We're ready to do the investments. Actually, in Colombia, we already have 3 banks, commercial and development banks, that have issued green bonds. However, when we talk to the private sector, the question is the opposite. We're not ready to make the investments. We're not sure what the benefits are. Maybe we are not ready to get a loan or to become in debt because of the investment. And also because they don't see that the policy has been already implemented. So there is a clear policy signal, but we still have to work on implementing the policies that in which economic sectors have to start make the investments needed to comply with the policy. So we do need to start working a little bit more with the private sector. I think most of the work has been done with the financial sector. They're already investors, commercial banks, but the private sector is a little bit shy still in the country to make the move.
Let me hear what our two private sector representatives say to that. Would you say there's some shyness out there? And if so, what's needed to really address that?
Okay. Two examples. How much is NBIM, as you know, the largest European asset owner with more than $1 trillion investing into infrastructures? Zero. How much is GPIF, the largest asset owner on earth, with $1.4 trillion investing into infrastructures? Zero. So, yeah, I mean, and we are not talking about infrastructures in Colombia, Chile, Morocco, or China. We talk about infrastructures everywhere. So even in Japan or in Norway, they don't invest locally. So the point is, I think it's super important to hear this message, that very, very few investors, with the rare exceptions of Canadians and some Australians and so on, are investing into infrastructures, period. Because if you ask an investor about equities, bonds, forex, they know. But if you put a project of biomass, wind energy, solar energy, 99% of the investors are just lost. They don't know. There's a huge asymmetry of information between the providers of the projects and the investors. So the question is, yeah, we need everything we said. We need, clear visibility. We need to package the project and so on. And then there's the last step. That means that we must make everything eatable by investors. And so we need to find ways to transform infrastructure projects that very few investors are buying into something they can buy in. And again, as I explained just before, that's one of the beauties of this IFC project. Because IFC is using the banks. Exactly as you said, the banks are ready. So, and they're issuing green bonds in Colombia. So the banks can play that role of intermediary between the world of infrastructures and the world of the investors. Because they can do the due diligence. They can do the diversification. When you buy the green bonds, you buy the balance sheet of the banks. You don't buy the specific projects. So suddenly you have the diversification with their retail markets, with the other projects, and so on. They can do the currency swaps. They can do all that stuff that makes the investors more comfortable. So I think that when we think about the financing from the projects up to the investors, we must hear the constraints of the investors, and then we must be innovative in order to construct the products that will help the investors finance this economy. And again, this IFC deal is a game changer. It's a game changer as well for another reason, is that, so I think I made my point, but it's a new way of thinking as well for developing banks. Because developing banks have always played a role in financing all these projects. But up to now, they were issuing AAA bonds in order to finance very safe projects. And for the first time ever, the IFC came with a new business model. They said, instead of issuing these AAA bonds and then finance the projects, but as we want to keep our AAA ratings, we will finance only very safe projects. Let's use our capabilities to provide something that will unlock the investors' capabilities. So instead of issuing bonds, we will provide this risk-sharing mechanism. And suddenly, with investing only about 5% of the fund, we will have 95% of the capital flows coming from the private sector. So what I'm trying to say is that when we think into the process, we need to find the players that can help, make the last mile. And developing banks with this new business model can play this role. So here you have a game changer in terms of products, but you have a game changer as well in a way that developing banks can think about their roles in mobilizing capital markets for public good.
Thanks very much. Mr. Smith, do you have something that you could almost describe as a checklist that would tell us what characteristics a project would have to have in order to be seen by investors as a bankable contribution to an NDC?
Yeah, see what you tend to do, you start off your checklist with with rule of law. Does a country have a PPP law or a contracts law, something you can actually enforce against the state sector, against the city, against the government, so that if they're shaping a project and they're telling you it's going to be like this, what happens if they're going to change it later on? Can you stop them? And this, I think, is that's your number one on your list. Then you can start looking at what's the track record of the counterparty. Do they follow through? Do they change if there's a change of government? Do all the rules change? And I think that's why one of the reasons that banks do infrastructure and investors are nervous, because in many cases you'll find there's a change of administration, change of government, change of city mayor, and they have a great idea that wouldn't it be good if, for example, in your transport project coming up to election year, if all the pensioners travel for free and then the nurses travel for free and then you change the age of students because this is a good thing for votes. And a bank will sit in front of the government or the city mayor and say, you can't do that. This is what you set out, this is what we approved, you can't do that. If you're an investor, you don't have that flexibility. You're pretty much stuck with what you've bought. And I think that one of the things that you have to be aware of is the investor community wants nice, safe things, because that's their fiduciary duty. They are supposed to produce a return year on year on year, for people like us, whose pensions are invested with them. So if they think that the rules of an infrastructure project will be changed, they don't want to get involved. Banks can have that conversation more easily. And the problem is these stories go across geographies, and it's common in UK, it's common in Europe. We've seen so many examples. And we've also seen examples, and this is perhaps more of a European thing, where if an entity is making more money than the government is expecting, the government likes to reduce it. And so, as an investor, you're anticipating that actually this is a good bet, we've gone in, and if these guys get good at it, they'll produce more money, my investment is even safer. And then suddenly find the government go, actually, we think they're now making too much money, we should stop that. As an investor, is going, whoa, hang on, that's just changed completely how I saw that project. So I think government interference is a big no-no for getting, private investment funds. They've got to understand that they've set the rules of the game, they have to stick to them.
Thanks very much. Ingrid Hoven, Mr. Samama told us we need to hear all the different voices and we need to essentially be talking to one another. So what voice can development partners like the BMZ, but also, of course, World Bank Group and others, add to that? We have heard the role of the IFC, but perhaps you can say a little bit about the BMZ and especially about the Partnership for Implementation. What exactly is it aimed at and how does it work?
Well, certainly it has, we all try through international cooperation, try to build a framework that would actually mobilize private capital infected into investments and development plans. Let me give you perhaps two examples. For instance, in Lima, we announced the so-called geothermal facility, which is a de-risking facility. Geothermal energy is actually a huge potential, especially for Latin America. So what have we done? KfW, the Inter-American Development Bank, the European Commission, bilateral donors have come in and have created a facility that would actually finance, on a grant basis, the exploration of geothermal potentials. This is a really costly venture, and many private investors, although they see the potential, they shy away of actually investing these resources, even if it's not successful after the exploration. So this grant facility actually covers this risk. If the exploration is successful, then the private investor has to repay the grant given to them for the exploration. So this is one mechanism to bring together the real world with the financial aspects and do some kind of de-risking. In Uganda, we tried to frame a new regulatory environment so that private investors can get into the renewable energy sector and the energy efficiency sector, especially for small and medium-sized enterprises. Again, this is like a fund, a facility that would actually provide structured funding so that the risk is being lower for private investors coming in. So these type of endeavors are being shaped by the international community already. The question now is whether we can get this first at scale so that we can elevate climate action. Secondly, that we really do the right things. And here I come to the NDC partnership. This was launched in Morocco 2 years ago, a year ago, and has already counts with more 60 countries that are partnering within the partnership in 15 international organizations. The partnership is about really doing the match between the needs identified by countries to implement the NDCs, and prioritization is a big and difficult task on many fronts. But then if you have a prioritized list of action, then to bring the international partners on board and say, look, this is what we really need with respect to policy changes, capacity building, and financial engineering. And please don't go this way, but please stay on course with us and provide the assistance that we need. And the additional bit that now has to happen is really that on the basis of such a prioritized list, that we listen to the private sector within the partnership, donors and governments alike, bring them in and try to figure out what is needed on the regulatory front, the framework conditions, the institutional setup that is needed, and then try to take the good examples on financial engineering and try to bring the private sector in. So we have already started, for instance, Colombia is one of those examples. But even in Mali is the least developed countries. But from the very beginning, when the NDC partnership gathered in Mali, in the capital, the Chamber of Agriculture, the industry representation was already at the table from the very beginning, even on adaptation measures, because we knew when it comes to water provision or energy provision, unless we mobilize and listen to the private sector, what does it take to be more efficient, it won't happen. And through this dialogue, we also hope that the government stay much more on course with respect to those clear signals that you were actually asking for. The next step certainly is, in order to provide more certainty to the private sector, is really to these framework conditions have to have some kind of legal underpinning, so that the private sector really believes it's not just a change for 2 or 3 years, but that we are there for the long haul, and that they have certain certainty that those price incentives or regulatory frameworks are stable. And this is what the NDC partnership is about. It's a multi-stakeholder approach. In some cases, donors and governments alike have to be convinced that this is the best way to go. It sometimes takes a little bit to understand each other. So dialogue is not always easy at the very beginning, because different stakeholders speak different languages. Investment cases, perhaps vis-à-vis public spending. But the good thing is, we have observed this like in Mongolia, in Mali, when those different stakeholders sit together, then out of a sudden, it becomes so obvious that unless, for instance, you shift the public spending in a certain direction, because you need a certain level of public spending on many fronts when it comes to infrastructure, you don't provide actually the groundwork for the private sector then to stay with you in the country and to mobilize additional capital. And so we are at the start, but I see a lot of potential for the medium term to make the scale-up action.
Great, and we have another audience question, last one to the audience on that subject. Michael, do you want to?
I hope it's the right one. It should be.
So, yep, that's it.
International partners can best support NDC commitment and implementation by helping to establish robust monitoring and review mechanisms to track the progress, expediting procedures to get finance to flow faster, improve coordination with each other, and focus on provision of risk guarantees rather than direct loans.
Very good. Thank you so much. Let's give the voting a little bit of time to ripen here. Strong support here for that third option, that international partners need to better improve their coordination with each other. Interesting. Okay, let's hear how the countries see it. What are you most interested in terms of support from development partners? So, not necessarily now the private sector actors, those as well perhaps, but especially from bilateral, from multilateral development cooperation partners. Mr. Searle.
I think I said it in cooperation in helping us developing a thorough, robust NDC investment plan and to help us in putting it into operation. I think that.
So capacity, really, in that case, in some ways.
I mean, I don't know, because we have some capacities in Chile to do it. But what it means in reality.
Yeah.
Because we're not talking about small project. I mean, it's maybe transformational.
Yeah, that's systemic.
Yeah, systemic. Yeah.
Okay, Ms. Calderon.
I agree with the audience on the need for better coordination, and definitely when the NDC partnership was established in Colombia, we definitely saw an improvement in that sense, because we need our developing partners to align to our priorities, to our needs, to respond to basically what the country has been doing. Sometimes we see international cooperators to come with a project and without asking the country whether the project is a priority, whether we already have that project going on with some other cooperators. So it's important that they do believe in what the country is doing and align to the priorities that we have already identified. And also to continue working on country ownership. So many of the international cooperation projects, they don't end up within the hands of national actors. They basically, when they finish, the project is finished and nothing gets, the country doesn't end up getting anything. So it's important that international corporations, the corporation also believes in country ownership. And that's what we'll be doing with the NDC partnership, to identify those gaps and to give specific signals to the bilateral institutions, the multilateral institutions, on what role can they play in filling the gaps that the country already has in moving into NDC implementation.
Thank you very much. So I'm looking up at the audience questions, and I think I'd like to go to some of those now. I see one I'd like to field to our two private sector representatives. I have to kind of turn my back out to read it properly, but how can the private sector not only get on board, but also apply pressure to motivate policy adoption? Mr. Samama or Mr. Smith, is that something you'd like to speak to?
Could I choose another?
Start. No. Can the private sector not only, please?
Because you talked about the importance of rule of law, of regulatory frameworks, of policy coherence. What can you do to perhaps really mobilize change?
I think it might be a bit of pushing back, maybe. Where you see things aren't working, that the private sector pushes back and makes it clear that this isn't thought out, and it does it early. I know an interesting example is in London. Now, since April, you cannot register a new taxi in London unless it's electric. So that sounds really great. So literally, and there's now 3 manufacturers of electric taxis in the UK. That sounds really great. So from a banking point of view, I should want to finance, if I believe taxis earn money, I should want to finance electric taxis. Only problem is, I have heard that Transport for London has also agreed that if you convert your diesel taxi to compressed natural gas, you can run that taxi for another 15 to 20 years. So my reaction as a private sector is to say, okay, no more financing for electric taxis, because it costs a lot more money to buy a new electric taxi than it does to basically add a CNG kit to a diesel taxi. So that is an example where the private sector has to speak up very quickly and say, you've just blown a hole in the policy, we're not going to do this, because my risk is I finance electric taxis and they basically never ever are able to compete against a converted fleet. So I think the private sector needs to speak up quickly and say where it sees things aren't working.
And what the private sector must do is, I would say, to do its job. It's to do its job of managing the risks. We all know that we are facing an unprecedented adjustment of the way we are managing the planet. And so if you're a long-term investor, you're facing massive transitioning risks. And markets being short-term oriented, they don't price necessarily very well these risks. So it means that it's part of your job to assess these risks, not to save the planet, but to manage the returns for the future. And when Mark Carney, in his famous speech, September 29, 2015, said, you investors, when you invest into a Peabody and so on, if you don't integrate climate change-related risks, you're breaching your fiduciary responsibility. And when a governor of a central bank says so and speaks about fiduciary responsibility, he has in mind that people can be sued. So it's a very strong message. And then by having the investors community doing that job of assessing the risks, it sends a very strong signal to the policymakers that actually they're taking their actions very seriously, that in a certain sense they're anticipating the success of regulation on climate change. And then you're creating a kind of positive cycle, because you have the investors community sending the signal to the policymaker that they are anticipating their success. And so for the policymakers, it's becoming even more, I would say, easy to regulate, and then the investors that will have anticipated that regulation will take advantage. So you're creating really a positive cycle. And a concrete example is that at the COP21,
Briefly, if you would, because I do want to get in a few more audience.
You had a group of investors, 32 investors, representing $3.6 trillion, including Allianz, ABP, and so on, that sent the signal to the policymakers that they were, before the agreement, before we got the deal, that they were taking the commitment to align their portfolios out of $3.6 trillion for $800 billion. So they were sending the signal to all the participants that they were already anticipating the success of what they were doing. And I can tell you, it was heard.
Thank you. Michael, do you want to pick out a couple more questions? They were hard to read
sure.
from here.
I'm a little loud. This one by Jaime. What policies or instruments have been implemented to take care for competitiveness? I'm going to throw this at Miss Colombia.
Right. So so far, we haven't foreseen that our climate policy is hurting competitiveness in the country. We do believe that as the country has a great potential to increase productivity, many of our economic sectors, the productivity is very low. It can be both objectives can be achieved, both increasing productivity and reducing emissions. And actually, in many cases, when you reduce emissions, let's say, for example, in the energy sector, you can also increase competitiveness. So far, in the process of implementation, we haven't seen or foreseen a risk in this sense. But definitely, as we go deeper into implementation, if we do see that our sectors could become hurt, then definitely the country will need to address to decrease that potential hurt on our economic sectors. We want to make sure that we grow and we reduce emissions, and we are not willing to make a trade-off between these two objectives.
Thank you very much. Maybe working one more?
I think we have 2 more minutes, and what we'll do is we'll have everybody answer 2 questions. Check it out. We'll start with Graham, and then work your way down to Melinda with just a yes or no answer. Do you think there are enough infrastructure projects for which banks have appetite out there? Graham, yes or no?
I couldn't understand.
Graham?
Well, I would like to say maybe.
Doesn't count. Yes. Next. Yes or no?
Mr. Samama?
Oh, sorry. Do you think
Are there enough infrastructure projects that banks have appetite?
No.
Do we have a shortage of good projects?
It depends on the banks, actually.
They're all saying maybe. Ingrid?
No, it's not the same situation in the US and in Europe. In the US, banks have left the market. In Europe, they are still there. So
right. It makes sense.
We need more better projects. We need more projects.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes.
Yes.
I think we do have right now a great infrastructure plan, and banks are willing to finance it.
Optimist?
Don't know.
And another maybe. Okay.
All right, and then
Thanks
the
very
last
much.
one, it's this one. Can NDCs effectively prepare sustainable market-based economic development through investment plans? Same, starting with you, Graham.
Bloody hell. This must have been written by an economist.
Kind of complicated.
No.
No. One no.
Instead of that, carbon price, it helps.
Yes.
No, but
You're with the no?
Yeah, it's
Okay.
you. No, it's your turn.
Who's answering?
no.
Then, okay.
Yeah.
I say yes.
Yes. Okay.
It's embedded in it.
Right, I say right. The purpose of NDC is to translate into investment plans.
Right.
Definitely.
Okay. And I have one more that I took from up there. I'm just going to get ask for a hand raising, so we won't even take the time for the yes or no.
Even better.
Who thinks the next batch of NDCs will be sharpened? Who thinks that we will actually see NDCs tightened, raised? That, of course, is the objective. 2 out of 3? Oh, okay. Wow. 5 out of 5. That's, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. That's a lot of optimists on this panel. Thank you very, very much to all of you for this very interesting exchange. Let's give them a warm round of applause.